6 weeks before I ended up on the tile floor of my own office with my colleague Jonah kneeling beside me and 3 other people already dialing 911. My family decided I was the answer to a problem they had all agreed on without me. Not my opinion, not my future, my name on a line. My name is Laurel Kane. I'm 31 years old, and I've spent most of my adult life working in mortgage underwriting compliance in Raleigh, North Carolina. I know exactly what it means when a document looks clean on the surface and isn't. That's my job. Finding the thing that doesn't add up before the thing that doesn't add up becomes someone else's catastrophe. My family knew this about me. That was the problem. I eventually understood the entire point. Before I get into what happened, I want to ask you something. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Because this story started on a Tuesday evening in April at a restaurant called the Ridgewood Grill on the west side of Raleigh, with pressed linen napkins in a corner booth. My Aunt Franny had reserved weeks in advance. If you've ever had someone use your own expertise against you. If you've ever had someone say you're so good with these things, right before handing you a document they needed you to sign and not question, you already know how this evening felt before I even walked in. I drove to the Ridgewood straight from work, still in my blazer, still carrying the tension of a denial memo I'd written that afternoon. The restaurant was warm and dim, in the way expensive places try to be. My aunt was already in the booth when I arrived, wearing the cream cardigan she reserved for occasions she considered important. Her husband Philip sat beside her, relaxed in the way of a man who had already decided. The night would go the way he'd planned it. And then there was Decker. Philip's son from his first marriage, 38 years old. He had his father's jawline and a way of taking up space in a room that felt deliberate, like he'd practiced it. He was mid-sentence when I walked in, describing a development project he was working on. Not just a building, he said. A destination. Mixed-use commercial on the ground floor. 3 stories of short-term rental units above. Located in a corridor of Raleigh that was, in his words, right on the edge of everything. My aunt touched Philip's arm and smiled like she was watching something wonderful unfold. Decker spotted me crossing the restaurant. There she is, he said, spreading his arms. The woman who reads the fine print on her birthday cards. A few people laughed. I smiled, because smiling was easier than explaining why the joke wasn't funny the third time. He kept going. Laurel once declined a free software trial because she didn't like the auto-renewal clause. Said it with the ease of someone who had rehearsed it. Philip laughed louder than anyone. After the food came and went, after the server cleared the plates and refilled the water glasses, Philip reached under the table and produced a manila envelope. He placed it in front of me, not beside me. In front of me, squarely, like it had always been heading there. Inside were loan documents for Decker's development project, a commercial mortgage application for $1.85 million on a property in the Oberlin Road corridor, a construction draw schedule, a secondary credit line for materials and contractor deposits. The total exposure across both instruments was substantial enough that I read the first page twice before I let myself read the second. Philip spoke quietly, which somehow made it worse. The lender wants a co-signer with W-2 income while Decker's LLC gets through a transitional period. 6 months, maybe 12. Then he refinances in his own name. Clean and simple. I worked in mortgage compliance. I processed applications exactly like this one on a weekly basis. I knew what the word co-signer actually meant. It didn't mean supporter. It meant primary liability. If Decker missed payments, the lender came to me. If he defaulted, his debt became mine. I didn't say no. Not yet. I said I'd need a few days to review everything before I could give them an answer. The booth went quiet, the way a room goes quiet when someone gives the wrong answer at the wrong time. My aunt set down her fork. Laurel, this is family. Decker needs people in his corner right now. Philip let a pause stretch before adding, sometimes trust matters more than caution. Decker leaned back and smiled. Take all the time you need. But the way he said it didn't match the words. I drove home with the envelope on my passenger seat and didn't sleep for most of that night. By 5 a.m, I had the document spread across my kitchen table and my laptop open to the North Carolina Secretary of State Business Registry. I was 3 searches deep before the shape of it started to emerge. Decker's LLC was called Oberlin Rise Group, registered 8 months earlier. Before that, there were 3 others: Summit Way Properties, Cardinal Peak Development, and a company called Alder Street Ventures that had been dissolved with no reported assets in 2022, following a mechanics lien filed by a general contractor in Wake County. The contractor had claimed $47,000 in unpaid labor. The lien had been recorded. The company had simply ceased to exist. I kept digging. The credit line Decker wanted me to co-sign wasn't his only open obligation. There was a defaulted equipment lease, a personal loan through a private lender, not disclosed anywhere in the packet he'd given me, and a small claims judgment from 2021 against a vendor who hadn't been paid. Buried inside a refinancing rider at the back of the folder was a balloon payment clause that would come due in 14 months, a structure that made no financial sense unless someone expected a large cash injection before then, or unless someone else was going to be standing in the way when everything fell. I sat at my kitchen table until the sky went pale outside the kitchen window. Then I called Adele. Adele Kwan was a real estate and contract attorney I'd been referred to 2 years earlier through a colleague. She was calm in the particular way of people who have seen too many situations like this one to be surprised by any of them. She read through everything I'd gathered quietly and thoroughly. About 25 minutes before she set the folder down and looked at me over her reading glasses. 2 open investor complaints with the Secretary of State's office, she said. 1 alleging misrepresentation of project timelines. The balloon payment alone disqualifies this as a sound co-signing risk under any underwriting standard I've worked with. She tapped the folder once. If you sign these documents, you're not supporting his project. You're absorbing it. I sat in my car in Adele's parking lot for 40 minutes after that meeting before I turned the ignition. That evening, I drove to my aunt's house in Cary. Franny had raised me for 3 years after my parents' divorce. I was 10. She was the one who made sure I got to school, who helped me with homework at her kitchen table, who kept that period of my childhood from becoming worse than it already was. When she married Philip 4 years ago, I had been genuinely happy for her. I had tried, consistently and deliberately, to be a fair-minded part of the life she'd built. Philip answered the door, cardigan, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He stepped back when he saw my face. My aunt appeared behind him. I laid out what I'd found. The dissolved companies, the open investor complaints, the undisclosed private lender, the balloon payment coming due in 14 months. I said it plainly, the way I would say it in a denial memo at work, because that was the only way I knew how to say something that hard. My aunt listened without interrupting. Her face didn't change the way it should have changed. There was no surprise in it. Franny, I said, did you already know about this? She looked at Philip, then back at me. We knew Decker was navigating a rough patch, but he's working through it. He has 2 investor complaints filed against him. Philip's jaw tightened. Decker takes risks. That's what it means to build something. You've spent your career telling people no. That's not the same thing as being right. I had spent 8 years protecting people from exactly this kind of exposure. And in that living room, in that particular moment, my entire professional history was being reframed as a character flaw. I'm not signing, I said. It was the first time I'd said it that clearly, without softening the edges. My aunt looked at her hands. Philip said they'd give me more time to think it through. I drove home in the dark and didn't call anyone. I just sat with the knowledge that my aunt had known, had been in that booth across from me, had watched the folder be placed in front of me, and had said nothing. 3 days later, Decker came to my office. I worked on the 4th floor of a 6-story building in downtown Raleigh. Open-plan layout, glass-walled conference rooms, a reception desk near the elevator bank. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Jonah was 2 desks over when I looked up and saw Decker crossing the floor toward me. He was not supposed to be there. He hadn't called. He hadn't been escorted up by security. I learned later he'd tailgated through the parking structure entrance and taken the elevator before anyone stopped him. We need to talk, he said. He wasn't quiet about it. Decker, this is my workplace. You can't. You're killing this deal. He wasn't lowering his voice. People were turning to look. Everything I've built is sitting on this one project and you're... I stood up. I am not doing this here. You need to leave. He stepped closer. His voice dropped, which was somehow worse than the volume. You think I don't know your numbers? I know your credit score. I know your salary range. I know you could do this without it touching you for a year. He took another step toward my desk. 1 signature. That is all this has ever been. Decker. Leave now. He grabbed my arm. I pulled back. He grabbed it again, harder, and when I twisted away, his other hand came across my shoulder. Not a punch, something between a shove and a push, but directed, intentional, and my hip caught the edge of my desk and my feet went out from under me. I went down hard on the tile. I remember how the ceiling looked from the floor. The grid of fluorescent lights, the acoustic tiles. I remember Jonah's voice before I could make sense of the words. I remember the sound of chairs scraping back. Decker stood over me. That's what protecting yourself instead of your family gets you. Jonah was already between us. Someone at the back of the floor was on the phone. I heard someone say security and someone else say call 911. I did not try to stand up and leave. I did not drive anywhere. I stayed on the floor, and when Jonah crouched beside me and asked what I needed, I told him to make sure someone had already called 911. he already had. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. Bruised hip. Sprained wrist from the way I'd caught myself on the way down. A gash above my right elbow that needed 4 stitches. One of the building's security supervisors came up to the floor, while I was still waiting for the ambulance, and walked me through what the lobby and floor cameras had captured. Decker entering through the parking structure. The timestamp on the elevator. Decker crossing the open floor toward my desks. And then all of it, the grab, the shove, the fall. Evidence doesn't care about family narratives. My aunt arrived at the hospital 40 minutes later. She came in while the doctor was finishing the stitches, still in her work clothes. Philip somewhere behind her in the hallway. I thought, for 1 second, the way you always think, she'll see this now. She'll finally understand what she was part of. Franny looked at my arm. Then she looked at the officer near the door, taking my statement. Her expression settled into something I hadn't seen from her before. Something managed, like a door being closed deliberately from the inside. Decker is not violent, she said. He's under an enormous amount of pressure, and this situation got out of hand because Laurel has refused to have a straightforward conversation. The officer looked at her steadily. Ma'am, we have footage of the incident from multiple angles. I'm sure it looked worse than it was. She turned to me. Her voice was quiet. Laurel, you've always had a way of making things harder than they need to be. If you had just talked to him like an adult. There are sentences that don't land loudly. They just arrive and sever something. He came to my workplace, I said. He put his hands on me. And you're standing here telling me I made it harder. Franny pressed her lips together. Think about what happens to this family if you pursue this. She left before I finished giving my statement. I watched her walk down the corridor with Philip and understood, in the way you understand, things that take a long time to fully believe, that she had made her decision before she ever walked into that hospital room. The detective assigned to the case was a woman named Soren Price. Calm, precise, the kind of person who makes space for information without decorating it. She came to the hospital the following morning and let me tell the whole story in the order it happened. The restaurant dinner, the documents, what I'd found in the business registry, what Adele had said, the 3 days of silence, and then Decker walking across my office floor on a Tuesday afternoon. When I finished, she looked up from her notes. Your aunt witnessed your condition and suggested you were responsible for the escalation. Yes. Detective Price held my gaze. This isn't just an assault case. The financial pressure campaign preceding the incident, the appearance at your place of employment, the contact pattern. We're looking at coercion, potentially witness intimidation, depending on what his communications show. For the first time since April, what had happened to me had names the law recognized. Not a family matter. Not me being inflexible. Not me failing to understand loyalty. Legal names, with definitions, with precedent behind them. Decker was arrested that evening. The building footage was unambiguous. Jonah's statement was unambiguous. The building manager at the parking structure confirmed that Decker had appeared twice in the previous week and had been asked on the second occasion. My aunt gave a statement the following afternoon. She said she believed her stepson had been provoked. Detective Price called me to let me know what had been said. I sat in my apartment afterward for a long time without turning on any lights. Adele filed civil complaints the following week, and within 10 days, a forensic accountant retained by one of Decker's former investors from the Alder Street Ventures collapse had filed his own suit independently. The fraud inquiry expanded outward from the original assault case the way these things do when someone finally starts pulling threads. Cardinal Peak Development, Summit Way Properties, 3 investors from 2020, who had quietly absorbed losses they'd never disclosed publicly, because they hadn't known where to report them. At the hearing, Decker's attorney built the expected defense. I was controlling. I was resentful of Decker's ambition. I had manufactured a crisis to damage a family that had tried to include me. My coworkers had been manipulated into supporting a false account. Then, the prosecution played the office footage. The courtroom went very still during the portion where Decker crosses the floor. And Jonah stands up from his desk. Under questioning, Philip finally said aloud what I had suspected at my aunt's kitchen table 3 months earlier. That he had known about the open investor Quant's complaints before the dinner at the Ridgewood. That he and Franny had discussed the risk to me and had decided not to disclose it because they believed I would be less cooperative if I understood the full picture in advance. The judge paused for a long moment after that answer. Franny, when asked directly, said she believed family members were obligated to carry one another's burdens, regardless of personal cost. I looked at my aunt across that courtroom. She did not look back. She had known. She had reserved that booth weeks ahead. She had sat across from me, and watched the folder be placed in front of me, and said nothing, and then she had come to my hospital room and told me I'd made things harder, not because she didn't know the difference between protecting someone and using them, but because she had decided, somewhere along the way, that my reliability was a resource that belonged to everyone who needed it, not a quality that belonged to me. Decker was sentenced to 18 months on assault and coercion charges, with a civil judgment pending from the investor lawsuit. The Oberlin Road property went into default within 60 days of the conviction. Cardinal Peak Development's remaining assets were frozen. As part of the ongoing fraud inquiry, Philip quietly resigned from the board of a local business development organization, before his name appeared in any official documentation. My aunt moved into a rental in Garner. People who had watched the whole thing told me afterward they kept using the word relief. It did not feel like winning. It felt like something I would need a long time to understand. My wrist healed in 6 weeks. The bruise on my hip faded faster than I expected. The 4 stitches came out on a Thursday in May, and the doctor said the scar would fade to almost nothing by winter. I kept looking at it anyway, in the right light. I started seeing a therapist named Dr. Ibarra that spring. She had a way of holding silence that didn't feel like waiting. In our 3rd session, she said something I wrote down afterward, and read more than once. Being the reliable one isn't a personality. It's a role someone assigned you early, and you accepted it because accepting felt safer than the alternative. I had been the reliable one since I was 10 years old. Since my parents' divorce, since Franny's kitchen table, since the 3 years she kept things stable for me, in a way that had mattered enormously at the time. I had carried forward the understanding that being stable was something you earned by never asking for too much, never creating inconvenience, never making your own limits visible. That understanding had worked, and it had also made me very easy to aim things at. The deepest injury was never the floor of that office. It was recognizing that the people who had benefited most from my reliability had, somewhere, started treating it like a policy they were entitled to invoke. That fall, I started doing financial literacy sessions through a housing nonprofit, working with adults across Raleigh and Durham. I focused on co-signing risk, personal guarantees, what it actually means to put your name on someone else's debt. I focused on what family language sounds like when it's covering a transaction, how the words loyalty and support and temporary get positioned around a piece of paper someone needs you to sign before you read it carefully. After one session, a man in his early 50s waited until everyone else had packed up and left. He stood near the door for a moment, turning his keys over in his hand. My daughter keeps using the word investment, he said. I didn't have a way to explain why it felt wrong to me until tonight. I had to look down at my notes for a moment before I responded. That was when the thing that happened to me stopped being only wreckage and started being something I could hand to someone. My friend Gwen had kept a key to my apartment the whole time. She'd shown up the night after the hospital with soup and no agenda, stayed on my couch for 3 days, and made me feel watched in exactly the right way. The way that means someone is paying attention because they want to, not because they need something. She was also the one sitting beside me at the hearing and who said afterward, when everyone else was still processing, "You held it all together in there." The following spring, a small group gathered at Gwen's back porch in the Mordecai neighborhood. Her string lights, her good coffee, the way she always puts out more food than anyone will eat. Adele came. Detective Price came off duty, still with her economy of movement. Jonah came with his wife, a few others, who had been present in different ways during the year. Someone asked, late in the evening, whether I regretted any of it. I thought about it honestly. No, I said. The only thing I regret is how long I believed that surviving the people who hurt me was the same thing as being loved by them. The porch went quiet, but the comfortable kind. The kind that holds something instead of needing to fill it. I walked home through the neighborhood that night, past the streetlights and the dogwood trees that bloom in Raleigh every April. In a ways that still surprises me, no matter how many springs I've been here. My wrist didn't ache anymore. The scar above my elbow had faded to the point where I had to look for it in certain light. Some things you carry forward. Some things just stop deciding the shape of everything ahead of them. If you have ever been handed a piece of paper with a family story wrapped around it, if you have ever been told your protection of yourself was the same thing as a betrayal, I'd really like to hear from you in the comments. You don't have to have the whole thing sorted out. Sometimes it just helps to know that someone else recognized the folder for what it was before they signed it.